Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Egypt. I'm Sami Zeidan. Well, it's been just under a week since three Al Jazeera journalists, Peter Greste, Mohammed Fahmy and Bahir Mohammed, were sentenced up to 10 years in prison, accused of spreading false news. Well, the outcome of the trial and the severity of the sentence were condemned around the world. Our colleagues in other networks joined us in protesting the verdict handed down in Cairo. Many called on the Egyptian government to simply give the three men a pardon. Well, that didn't seem to have much effect on Egypt's president, though, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. A day after the trial, he said he couldn't interfere in the court's ruling. Well, President Sisi's refusal to intervene was seen as a slight to US diplomacy and leverage over Egypt. It came just hours after the White House demanded our journalist's immediate release, and only 2 days after US Secretary of State John Kerry promised he would unfreeze around $500 million of suspended aid money. Well, Al Jazeera's staff aren't the only journalists to have been targeted in Egypt. In fact, the country ranks as the third most dangerous place in the world for reporters, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. Recent victims of the crackdown include the popular satirical show Al Barnameg, which has poked fun at the president and was finally cancelled last month. And in January, American journalist Jeremy Hodge was arrested on suspicion of being a member of a foreign spy ring. Well, let's bring the guests into the show now. From Brussels, we're joined by Ernest Sagaga, Head of Human Rights Safety Department for the International Federation of Journalists. And from Boston, Tarek Masoud, Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Tarek is also the author of the book Counting Islam: Religion, Class and Elections in Egypt. Good to have you with us. Ernest, if I could start with you, what do you think this ruling on the Al Jazeera journalists means for the way that the media will operate in Egypt going forward?
Well, clearly there's going to be a reluctance on the part of media organizations in Egypt to say anything which is perceived as a critic of the government, which is, of course, not good for democracy, because, as somebody has said, dissent is the highest form of patriotism.
That already seems to have changed, doesn't it? Ernest, that already seems to have changed. If you compare the role of the media during perhaps the era of Morsi to now, some ask, where have all the bold television critics of the government and ministers all gone?
Well, where they have gone, it's quite clear. They have gone and that they have been trying to operate under the radar, because even before the verdict against our three colleagues, I think there has been a trend ever since the overthrow of President Morsi of a crackdown on media which are seen as favoring the opposition, whether right or not or wrong, but that has been the trend. And I think what we have seen last week or beginning of this week is really the ultimate attempt to intimidate, especially for foreign media, because they normally will be able to operate outside the control of the government. But by getting these people behind bars in the way that it was done, it was a clear signal to foreign reporters in Egypt that they are not beyond the reach of the Cairo government.
Okay, let's bring in Tarek into the discussion. Some say that when you look at perhaps the background of some of the dominant players on the media scene, you find they have links, do they not, to some of the figures associated with the old guard, the former regime of Mubarak. How much of that is a factor in the changing media climate?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Sammy. You certainly do hear that many of the some prominent journalistic personalities, I think particularly of somebody like Mustafa al-Bakri, for example, has links to maybe parts of the security apparatus in Egypt. More broadly, even outside of exceptional cases like al-Bakri, you have to remember that even in the private media, which are, the media in Egypt is basically two forms, right? You've got the privately owned and the state-owned. And the state-owned, it's not surprising that personalities in the state-owned media would perhaps toe the state's line. And then the privately owned media, remember, these are owned by businessmen who were friendly with the Mubarak government and at odds with the Morsi government, and so you would expect, even there, if they were to toe an editorial line, it would generally be in favor of the government. So that's clearly part of what's going on.
So, I mean, is the situation now, as we've seen in this ruling that's come down against Al Jazeera journalists as well as other journalists operating in Egypt, that you're either trying to operate independently but being squashed, or you're towing the line either out of fear or because your backers have financial or other interests in the status quo of the regime?
Yeah, I think that's not far from the truth. It's not just the Al Jazeera journalists, as you mentioned. I'll note in your introduction, you said that Bassem Youssef was also a victim of the crackdown. Bassem Youssef's a little bit different in that he was not subject to any kind of legal action by the state. That's not what canceled his show. So he's a little bit of an exceptional case, probably not the same as the Al Jazeera journalists. But just last week, for example, in Al-Minya, there was a reporter who was sentenced or who was jailed for reporting on sectarian violence in that part of Egypt, which is in Upper Egypt. And people have intimated that one of the reasons he was jailed was not just because he was reporting on sectarian violence that the state doesn't want to hear about, but because he personally had converted from Islam to Christianity, and that also poses problems for the Egyptian state. The Egyptian state doesn't quite know how to deal with people like that. So there is clearly a constriction of the space for reporting in Egypt after July 3rd, 2013. It's absolutely incontrovertible.
All right, with everything that's going on with journalists, Ernest, this is not just a threat to journalists, it's a threat to wider civil society functioning, is it not?
It could be, because clearly media normally reflects the opinions, the diversity of the opinions which are prevailing in a country at any given time. And if then the media is suppressed, you clearly are also suppressing those views because they have no other venues to be expressed. And that's a very challenge, not only to press freedom, but also to democracy as we know it and as we wish it to be in any country ruled by the rule of law.
All right, let's quote here, if I may, what Gamal Eid, he's the chairman of the Arab Network for Human Rights and Information. I'd just like to read a quote, what he has said recently. Generally, we can say that the new rulers are intent on dealing a blow to all civil society organizations because these are critical of the injustice and the tyranny that prevails in this nation. The new president apparently wants to silence all critics at the start of his tenure. Now, he was saying that after security forces seized the current edition of Al-Wasla magazine that's published by his organization. And I mean, I guess, Tarek, does this not really symbolize what other civil society organizations are going to face going forward?
Well, I think that that's probably an accurate description. I mean, look, I don't think that we're going to go back to the days of Gamal Abdel Nasser, for example, where reporting was so constricted and the only news you would get would be news that the state wanted you to hear. I think that Egypt has progressed too far from that, and I think more importantly that even if the media at this particular moment in time seems to be towing the line of the regime, you've got to remember that they probably view themselves as being in a kind of extraordinary political situation where division in the domestic ranks is unhelpful. They think of themselves as still confronting a terrorist threat from the Muslim Brotherhood. But I don't think it's correct to say that we won't, for example, in the media have, in the Egyptian media, continue to have criticism of journalists or even criticism of the government. I think things have gone too far for that, and you still will see criticism of the government. So I think that you're certainly right that the space for free reporting has constricted a little bit, and it certainly quite chilling with respect to the sentences meted out to the journalists of your organization. But I think that it's still too early to say that there's going to be a complete crackdown on media that will prevent any kind of reporting on what the state is doing.
All right, but what does it mean for human rights organizations? Like the chap I just quoted, he heads a human rights organization. What does it mean for think tanks, for students' associations and unions? How will they operate? If you, as you said, we're not going back to the Mubarak era. Where are we going then for these sorts of organizations in being able to meet, to protest and criticize?
Well, remember that one of the first moves of the new government was to issue a new protest law which severely restricts protests. So I do think in that regard we are moving backwards. And, you know, I think that if you look at a law that was just passed, I believe last week, where now the president of the country appoints the heads of universities, which had previously been something that university faculties were allowed to do themselves since 2012. This, again, I think is an attempt of the state to reassert control over the universities, which, as you know, is full of students who are active and are protesting. So there absolutely is this attempt by the state to assert its control. I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think it's going to work. I think that society has progressed too much and changed too much for it to go back to the status quo ante. But I do think that when it comes particularly to this issue of the Islamists, when it comes particularly to this issue of the Muslim Brotherhood, when it comes to the issue of the July 3rd, 2013 coup, when it comes to things like the legitimacy of the current government, I think those do constitute red lines for this regime, and I do think that they will be pretty active in trying to make sure that nobody crosses those red lines.
All right, I'm glad you mentioned there the protest law. Ernest, if we talk about some of the laws, Egypt has adopted a constitution a short while ago. If you look at some of the laws, some of the constitutional principles on things like freedom of the press, freedom of association, what is your analysis of it? Are these laws that essentially restrict people's freedom, or are they good laws but they're just not being implemented?
Quite interestingly, the new constitution you mentioned actually provides for the press offenses, if you may use the term press offenses. It basically prevents any journalist being incarcerated because of those kind of offenses. So what we have seen by the prosecution of the journalists, both Al Jazeera journalists but also other journalists, and their subsequent jailing is actually going against the new constitution. Therefore, we all applauded when the new constitution was adopted. We thought it was a progressive constitution, but in practice, I don't think anything had changed. Of course, it's very clever to see the way they charged our colleagues. They charged them for publishing false information about Egypt. I'm not even sure how you can qualify that under ordinary law, let alone under the constitution.
So you have a situation where clearly some laws are not being implemented and other laws are put down on paper, as Tarek pointed out there, that are restrictive when it comes to the rights to protest, at least. Let's perhaps talk about another point. Where have the generation of bloggers gone, Tarek? Those sort of people who are not formally organized politically under the umbrella of any of the established political parties. What's happened to them, the people, the youth who used to mobilize the street through blogging and websites and Twitter?
Well, that's
I think the danger here,
Sorry, that question was actually for Tarek.
Okay, d'accord.
Sorry. Thank you. So I think that this is part of why I think that we're not going back to the old days, precisely because there are these channels for communicating with people that are outside of the control of the state. And so absolutely there continues to be an active Twitter sphere, there continues to be an active blogging. So it's not as if the abuses of the state aren't known. I would also say, you know, the youth that you mentioned, the kind of the youth of the revolution, they inhabit a very unique position at this moment in Egyptian history, right? Because they see themselves very much as neither partisans of the ousted president Mohamed Morsi nor of the new president Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Their political stance, to the extent that they have one, can sort of be summarized by the phrase, "a pox on both your houses." And these youth that I speak to very much see themselves as being in a waiting mode, that they think that the Egyptian revolution is a long-term process. It began with the overthrow of Mubarak, then they succeeded in bringing down the Muslim Brotherhood, and they have an appointment coming up with the deep state that currently runs Egypt. And so I do think that these groups that you are talking about and these individuals you are talking about still remain. If you look at the Egyptian blogosphere, they're still active, and I do think that
some of them have been jailed, haven't they? Like members of the April 6th movement and so on.
Sure, like Ahmed Doma and Ahmed Maher, you're absolutely correct, but not all of them have been jailed. The most prominent ones, I mean, this is true of basically every political movement in Egypt. But at the same time, you know, this is a very big group of people, the youth, and I don't think it's possible for the state to suppress. And I think, again, if you just follow what people are saying on the web or on Twitter, you'll see that they haven't disappeared. And remember, this is probably the group in society that has always been the least bothered by the state's attempts to jail them. They are the least risk-averse in that regard. So again, I don't think that they have disappeared. I do think that politically their stance is a little bit complicated at this particular moment. But again, I think that they're one of the reasons why, if you have some hope for Egypt, it's because of people like this.
Ernest, despite some verbal criticism, despite the fact that organizations like yours and journalists in general have been quite vocal, does it seem like world powers, though, have decided to resume what you could call business as usual with the Sisi regime and authorities now?
Well, that remains to be seen. But in any case, Egypt is a very important country, in terms of geopolitics of the region. So clearly, these powers and partners of Egypt would want to continue the dialogue, and actually not against continuing the dialogue, because I think through the dialogue they can press their ally in Egypt on the need to respect independence of journalists, of respecting the rule of law. So it can only happen if there is a dialogue going. We don't want a confrontation between Egypt on one hand and its partners and allies on the other. But just going back for a minute, if I may, by actually restricting the movement and the independence of journalists, professional independence, there is a danger for the government that they will be opening up a space for bloggers who are not necessarily professional journalists, who are not bound by the principles by which we carry out our profession. And those criticisms will continue, but may not even be in a fair way to the government. So they sort of shooting themselves in the foot by going after professional journalists who are only reporting on facts, putting them in context, and trying to be responsible throughout.
All right, but I guess my question is, do you think governments, some of the important governments that have good relations with Egypt, have used their leverage and raised their voices as loudly, perhaps, as you think, Ernest, they could have when it comes to the treatment of journalists your organization seeks to defend?
Well, I have to say that the initial reaction has been positive. We heard the U.S. Secretary of State denouncing the verdict and actually apparently calling his counterpart in Egypt to raise his concerns. We heard the British summoning up the ambassador of Egypt to London, something in other European countries. And so that is positive. Now they need to make something out of it. They shouldn't just let it drop. They should continue pressing for the release of these journalists, and we would definitely hold them to that, because they said they agree with us in their opposition to what has happened in Cairo.
And of course, we should remember perhaps that it's not only journalists who are behind bars being held without trial or charge. To give an example, Khalid Qazaz, an aide to the former deposed president Mohammed Morsi, who was held without trial for almost a year. Here's an excerpt of something which he said in a letter which was smuggled out of Tora prison and republished in a newspaper. And he says, "I have struggled to understand the silence of the international community over our arrests in July 2013. When the military ousted the Egyptian government, almost none of our international partners stood up for us. For most, it was as if we never existed. The silence was so thorough that I joked with my colleagues, do we really exist, or were we photoshopped in?" Now, Tarek in Boston, regardless of what one may feel towards the policies of Morsi or his aides, when you have a man who's been held in a jail for almost a year without a trial, without a charge, that does make you wonder whether he has a point when he says, where are all the international voices to say what's going on?
Well, I think, Sami, that you've got to obviously differentiate between the journalists, your colleagues, who are being jailed on charges that I think most credible observers agree are trumped-up charges, activists like Mahi Noor or Ahmed Maher, who are being jailed for their activism, and then members of the Mohammed Morsi government, whom the state has basically been detaining since the summer of 2013. And that is much more political and constitutes, I think, much more of a red line for the Egyptian government. I think that to the extent that the Egyptian government might be influenced on the issue of activists or journalists, I don't think at all it will be influenced on the issue of members of the Morsi government, whom I think members of the Egyptian state and particularly the security apparatus really believe themselves when they say that Mohammed Morsi was threatening Egyptian national security, that his government was composed of people who were trying to undermine Egypt. They believe that, regardless of whether we believe it. And so I think international leverage on that issue is likely to be quite minimal. I think that it's important to differentiate between these two, and to the extent that you can put a little bit of pressure to put it on the government to open the space for journalists, to release journalists who have been jailed illegitimately. But I don't think you'd have much progress if you tried to get them to suddenly change their attitude towards the Morsi government. Okay,
Ernest, talking about expectations for leverage, there were expectations, perhaps there still are, that perhaps when things settle down in terms of Sisi settling into the presidency, there'll be more of an opening, perhaps relaxation of some of those tough laws we were talking about that restrict protests, perhaps more application of laws that are supposed to guarantee freedoms. But from your perspective as a professional journalist, when the limit or the extent of one's hopes is not the institutionalization of freedoms, but the personal application by a president, is that something good, or is that actually a step backwards?
Well, I think when a government is trying to come out of a transition and presumably toward the democracy, of course there will be problems, of course there will be difficulties. But it seems to me that it's very important for the new government in Egypt to start implementing or respecting the most fundamental of our rights, including free speech, including freedom of association. And I don't think you can say, well, let's deal with one thing now and then come back to these rights later on. These are actually part of international human rights law, to which, of course, the Egypt is mostly a state party, and they have to apply at all times, including when things are difficult. You cannot wait until when things are so good and rosy before you apply these fundamental rights. They have to apply in both difficult and good times as well.
All right, we'll have to leave the discussion there. Let's thank our guests, Ernest in Brussels and Tarek in Boston. And you can keep up to date, of course, with Al Jazeera's extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Egypt on air and online. Let us know your thoughts. I'm Sami Zeidan. For now, it's goodbye.